laughter, the clinking of glasses, the aroma of roasted turkey. It all seemed like an ordinary holiday feast. Until David's hand swung up and came crashing down on Emily's face, a stinging slap that froze the entire room. The sharp crack of the slap tore through the air like a whip, slicing apart the chatter and the clinking of silverware around the Thanksgiving table. The room went still. Emily's head jerked to the side, her long hair falling forward, hiding the reddening mark spreading quickly across her cheek. She drew in a sharp breath, her eyes blinking rapidly, as if trying to hold back the tears. Around the table, everyone sat frozen. Some gaped with open mouths. Others quickly bowed their heads, pretending to focus on the turkey on their plates. And in a few glances, I caught a flicker of cruel satisfaction. David Callahan, Emily's husband, remained standing, his arms still suspended midair. His chest heaved, his breath ragged, his eyes burning with barely restrained fury. He tilted his head slightly, his words hissing through clenched teeth. "Never humiliate me in front of my family again." No one spoke. The dinner that was meant to be a gathering of warmth had turned into a silent stage, where a slap was treated as something ordinary. I sat at the far end of the table, my hands clenched so tightly under the tablecloth that my knuckles turned white. I am Diane Mercer, 60 years old, once a colonel in the United States Army. For 35 years, I have seen soldiers scream in panic, heard gunfire thunder louder than heartbeats. But David's eyes were not chaos. They were cold, sharp, the eyes of a man accustomed to domination, thriving in the shelter of silence. Emily, my only daughter, was once strong, once lived with a heart bursting with colors. She was an art teacher, turning her little home into a haven of paintings, music, and laughter. I still remember the days she sat in the sunlit kitchen, coloring while laughing loudly about her students' stories. But over the past 2 years, those colors have faded. The house grew silent, the kitchen dim, her laughter rarer and rarer. At first, I told myself it was the strain of marriage, the burden of family responsibilities. But then, the signs became too clear to ignore, painfully clear. A bruise peeked out from beneath her makeup. Once, Emily stumbled through an excuse. I tripped on the table's edge. Her shoulders flinched whenever David's voice called from another room. In conversations, she always stood behind him, as if she needed to shrink herself to avoid attention. When I asked, she only gave a faint smile. "I'm fine, Mom." But her hands trembled when holding a teacup, and her eyes never had the courage to meet mine. At the dinner table, David didn't need to shout. One cold, sharp glance was enough to silence Emily. In public, he would drape an arm around her shoulders, at first glance protective, but in truth, a chain. I used to teach my soldiers. The most dangerous man is not the one who fires the first bullet, but the one who waits patiently for your weakest moment. David was exactly that kind of man. He knew how to chip away at strength, at trust, until the daughter I had raised became small and voiceless. But what he didn't know was that for the past 2 months, I had been gathering every word, every trace, every piece of evidence. He was no match for the silence I chose. And on this Thanksgiving night, when he raised his hand in front of his entire family, I knew the time had come. His family played their roles so naturally, as if they had rehearsed this theater long ago. Patricia Callahan, his mother, spoke in a honeyed voice, though every word carried a blade behind the sugar. "Oh, Emily, you're too sensitive." David just lost his temper a little. Vanessa, his sister, let out a bitter laugh, perfectly timed to rub salt into the fresh wound on Emily's cheek. The brother-in-law nodded along, as if he had witnessed a harmless joke, not a slap that froze the room. It was a twisted performance, where Emily was cast as the incompetent wife, while David wore the costume of the patient hero. A cruel charade, so thorough that those within it no longer saw the truth. I knew that rushing in headfirst would be like striking a match to a barrel of gasoline. Everything would explode, and Emily would be the one to suffer. In the military, I learned a lesson. Sometimes to win, you must suppress the instinct to strike back and wait for the right moment. I remember an old comrade once said, "Evidence is the silent weapon. It doesn't need to shout, but when revealed, it ends the battle instantly." I had lived by that creed, so I watched more closely. With every visit, I began to read the signals, the faint bruise on her arm, the way her voice shrank when David entered the room, the sudden change of subject mid-sentence. It wasn't coincidence. It was a pattern. And if there's one thing I learned from decades of command, it's this: once you recognize the pattern, you can see the whole picture. Then one stormy evening, I dropped by Emily's house unexpectedly with a hot casserole. From the window, I saw David blocking her in the kitchen, his tall frame looming over her. His shoulders were rigid, his hand jerking with every word I couldn't hear. Emily stepped back half a pace, just enough for me to see fear gnawing at her every nerve. When she opened the door, her smile was stiff, like a mask hastily pressed onto her face. David went upstairs, Emily said, but her eyes were lowered, and I caught sight of a red mark on her forearm, the imprint of fingers gripping tight, something I had seen before in the barracks when soldiers forgot to stop lifting weights in time. But here it wasn't training. It was control. That night, I made my decision, not with tears, not with pleas, but with undeniable truth. The next day, I went to a security supply store run by a former Marine. I bought 3 hidden cameras, a photo frame, a smoke detector, and a tiny one that fit perfectly on a bookshelf. I added a recorder no bigger than a thumb. Every device stamped dates, triggered by motion, undeniable. On my next visit, I brought Emily a few gifts: a framed photo, a decorative smoke detector, and a book casually placed on her shelf. She suspected nothing. 6 weeks later, I had what I needed: footage of David snarling because dinner was 10 minutes late, images of him shoving Emily in the hallway, his hand clamped around her wrist until she wrenched free in pain. Every file was duplicated, one copy locked in a safe, another uploaded to an encrypted cloud. I said nothing to Emily. Not yet. Survivors sometimes protect their abusers until they are confronted with the raw truth. I needed my daughter to see it with her own eyes, and to know a way out had already been prepared. By mid-November, I was ready, but evidence alone wasn't enough. I needed a public stage, where his entire family would be forced to see. The chance came when David, with false courtesy, called to invite me for Thanksgiving. "Emily will be glad if you're there," he said, but what I heard beneath was clear. It was an order, another layer of control. Fine. At his own table, this theater would collapse. I immediately called Sarah Jennings, a former comrade, now working in the military justice system. She listened, then answered firmly, "I'll be there, and I'll bring enough paperwork to end this right on the spot." Thanksgiving arrived. I showed up early, carrying a casserole, my eyes scanning the living room as if surveying a battlefield. Emily greeted me, her hand icy cold, her eyes flickering with fear. David only gave a slight nod, indifferent, as if I didn't exist. I sat down, inhaling deeply. Years of being a soldier had taught me, well, the feeling before a campaign began. And this time, the battlefield wasn't some faraway land, but right inside this house. David roared, his voice cracking between anger and panic. "This is a setup. You're all conspiring against me." He lunged a step toward me, his chair crashing backward. In that instant, Sarah placed a hand on her hip. She didn't need to draw her weapon, but her cold, sharp gaze froze him in place. The elegant dining room suddenly felt suffocating, like an interrogation chamber. Emily remained still, her trembling hand brushing the red mark on her cheek. But her eyes no longer showed only fear. There was a determination I had never seen before. I've been silent too long," Emily said, her voice breaking but clear. "No one forced you to do those things. You exposed yourself." David snapped his head toward his wife, his face twisting, flushed red. But this time, he couldn't take another step. Sarah had already opened the file and pulled out a paper stamped with a glaring red seal. "This is a temporary restraining order, effective immediately. If you refuse, we'll call backup to remove you from here." Patricia cried out, her voice trembling. "David, listen. Sit down. Don't make this worse." But he didn't listen. His eyes darted around the table, searching for allies in his own family, but found only bowed heads and averted gazes. Vanessa pressed her lips tight, tears streaming silently. Brian fidgeted, gripping his glass of wine, unable to say a single word in defense. I locked eyes with him, my voice low and steady. "You think you're untouchable, David. But tonight it ends. There's no darkness left to hide in." For a moment, the room fell silent, the only sound the ticking clock. Then David let out a guttural snarl, half growl, half hiss. "You'll regret this. All of you." He snatched his coat, stormed out the door, the slam echoing like a final stamp. No one followed. Sarah folded the file, her gaze softening as she looked at Emily. "It has officially begun, but this time, in a different direction, toward justice." I stepped closer and placed my hand on my daughter's shoulder. Emily looked up, tears shimmering in her eyes. Yet her gaze burned bright, not the gaze of a woman cornered, but of someone who had reclaimed her own voice. On the day of the verdict, David still wore that same false confidence, his suit perfectly pressed, as if a few clever words could overturn his fate. But when the judge read the final lines, voice echoing through the courtroom, a restraining order for 5 years, effective immediately, I saw his shoulders sink. The first fall of a man, used to standing above others, is always heavier than any sentence. Emily sat beside me, her hand gripping the edge of the chair. When everyone rose to leave the courtroom, she didn't cry, didn't speak. But I saw her chest rise and fall, like someone breaking the surface after being underwater for far too long. In the days that followed, the house once filled with arguments became strangely quiet. Emily slowly grew accustomed to the silence. At first, she startled whenever the phone rang or the window creaked open in the wind. But little by little, she found her own rhythm again. I caught her making tea in the morning, playing soft music in the kitchen. Simple things she had never dared to do before, for fear of ridicule or dismissal. One evening, as I set a cup of tea in front of her, Emily whispered, "Mom, all these years, I thought I wasn't strong enough to break free. I was wrong, wasn't I?" I held her hand, fragile, but warming in mine. "You were never weak, Emily. You were only bound for too long. Now every chain has broken." Outside, the winter wind swept through the bare trees, whistling like echoes of an old battle. But in that small kitchen, I knew a new season had begun. A season without David. A season where Emily could learn how to live for herself again. As time passed, Emily's small apartment slowly turned into a place truly worthy of being called home. The shelves filled with student novels she brought back from class. The white walls held drawings gifted by her pupils, and the kitchen corner always carried the faint aroma of roasted coffee. Every small detail was proof she was regaining control of her life. One autumn evening, as the rustle of leaves drifted in through the window, Emily looked at me, her voice low and steady. Sometimes I still wonder, if that day hadn't unfolded the way it did, would I still be sitting here now? I squeezed her hand, meeting the eyes that were no longer so sorrowful. You would still be here, Emily, but it might have taken many more years to find your path. What matters is you finally stepped out. This time, the smile on her lips was no longer fragile. It was steady, calm, like a candle that keeps burning bright even as the wind outside continues to blow. I know those who have never lived through it will always ask, why not stop it sooner? Why wait until the danger reached its peak? But the truth is, I learned in the military that every confrontation requires the right timing. One wrong step, and the entire plan could collapse. And with Emily, I didn't want to save her for just one night. I wanted to make sure she was free forever. David lost everything, not just because of the court's verdict. He lost his control, he lost the power to define his wife's worth, and he lost the silence he had relied on to dominate. Emily rose from the wreckage, not to return to who she once was, but to become a stronger version of herself. In the service, I had seen battles that seemed unwinnable, and I knew that victory depended not only on firepower, but on preparation, patience, and belief in the mission. That night, my mission was clear: to force the light to shine into the darkness David had created. If someone reading these words recognizes their loved one within them, please trust your instincts. Listen to them. Look closer. And when the time comes, stand beside them. Even if it's only with a word of affirmation, a gesture, or a piece of crucial evidence. Because true protection is not just about raising a shield. It is about cutting the danger off at its root, so it never has the chance to grow back again. And if this story reaches you, share it. Somewhere, someone may be waiting for this very moment to know that they are not alone, that the path to freedom still exists, and that sometimes silent patience is the most powerful counterattack of all.